She was just a lonely little girl dancing by herself while everyone laughed, until a millionaire in a blue suit stepped onto the floor and changed her life forever. 6-year-old Clara Anderson stood quietly at the edge of the school gymnasium, clutching the soft fabric of her light blue dress. It had small frills at the shoulders and a faded satin ribbon at the waist. The dress was a little too big for her, handed down from a box of donated clothes at the orphanage, but she loved it anyway. It made her feel like a ballerina, like someone who belonged in a fairy tale. Her hair, pale and golden, was pulled into a neat bun, and her blue eyes searched the room with a flicker of hope that slowly dimmed as reality set in. The music had already started. Parents were twirling their children in pairs across the polished floor, laughing, spinning, clapping to the rhythm. All around her, Clara saw classmates beaming in the arms of their mothers and fathers. Little boys clumsily danced with their dads. Girls in pastel dresses rested their heads against their moms' shoulders during slow songs. Clara remained alone. She took a deep breath. Miss Ellen, her caretaker at the orphanage, had encouraged her to go, had said she didn't need anyone to dance with to have a good time. Just feel the music, she had said, and smile. When you smile, the world smiles back. Clara tried to believe that. She stepped onto the floor, lifting her chin slightly and spreading her arms as the music swelled. She moved gently, carefully, as she had practiced alone in her room at night when no one was watching. She twirled, let her feet glide, imagined what it would be like to have someone waiting for her at the edge of the room, clapping just for her. But the laughter began almost immediately. At first it was quiet, whispers and giggles. Then louder. "She's dancing alone," a boy shouted. "Where's your mom, Clara?" "Oh right, you don't have one," came a high-pitched voice from the side. A group of girls huddled together, trying to stifle their laughter but making no real effort to hide their smirks. One of them mimicked Clara's spin, flailing her arms exaggeratedly. Clara felt the sting. Her cheeks burned. But she kept dancing. She kept dancing because stopping would mean letting their words win. She kept dancing because it was all she could do not to cry. She kept dancing because, somewhere deep down, she still believed that maybe, just maybe, someone would see her, really see her, and not turn away. Among the crowd seated on folding chairs at the back of the gymnasium sat Alexander Reeves, a man who, under most circumstances, never attended school functions. He wasn't married, had no children of his own, and usually avoided public appearances that weren't tied to business. But that evening, he had agreed, reluctantly, to accompany his sister and nephew to the school's annual family dance. His assistant had insisted it would be a good PR move, something that showed he supported the community, and Alexander, tired and overbooked, had nodded just to end the conversation. He wore a tailored light blue suit, pressed to perfection, his dark brown hair combed neatly, and his face wore the same expression it always did, measured, unreadable, focused. He was known for making ruthless decisions in boardrooms, for seeing numbers instead of people, for valuing logic over emotion. He was not known for smiling. He was certainly not known for dancing. Yet something about the girl on the dance floor caught his attention in a way he couldn't explain. At first, it was just a glance. He was scrolling through emails on his phone when his eyes lifted and saw her spinning alone. Her dress fluttered slightly as she moved, not in the graceful rhythm of a trained dancer, but with a kind of quiet courage that made his fingers still on the screen. She was small, her shoulders tense, but there was a fierce determination in her eyes. It was only when he noticed that no one was with her, no partner, no parent, no adult guiding her hand, that he truly started to watch. The laughter reached him soon after. He saw the pointing fingers, the mocking voices, the way the girl's face flushed but didn't fall. She didn't stop moving. He couldn't look away. Alexander Reeves had spent decades perfecting the art of disconnection. It had been necessary, in some ways, for survival. He had grown up hard, built an empire from the ground up, and had long since taught himself to ignore the parts of life that didn't fit into spreadsheets or strategy. But something about the way this child kept dancing while being ridiculed by her peers pierced through all of that. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, stranger, like recognition. Like memory. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, his elbows on his knees, his eyes following her every step. The rest of the gym seemed to fade, the flashing lights, the overenthusiastic DJ, the parents posing for photos. All he could see was her. Something twisted inside his chest. He had no idea why. His sister, seated beside him, noticed his stillness. She whispered something, he didn't hear it. His phone buzzed again, he ignored it. In that moment, there was a sudden and overwhelming clarity in him, a strange urgency he hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. He stood. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't rehearsed or planned. He just rose from his chair, smoothed the front of his jacket, and began walking toward the girl on the dance floor. The polished soles of his shoes echoed faintly against the wood as he crossed the gym. Conversation dipped, a few parents turning their heads. A teacher paused mid-clap. The music played on, but now it felt like something else had begun, something no one could name just yet. The children nearest to the girl stopped giggling and stared. She hadn't noticed him yet. She had just completed another slow spin, her arms held out awkwardly like a bird trying to fly, when he stepped into the light beside her. She stopped. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a quiet confusion. He knelt on one knee, not minding the sharp creases of his suit, and extended a hand to her with surprising gentleness. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice steady, warm, but low enough that it was meant only for her. There was a beat of silence so complete it rang. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then around the gym, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake. No one did. No one could. Slowly, almost cautiously, she placed her small hand in his. And for the first time in years, Alexander Reeves smiled. The moment Clara's small hand touched Alexander Reeves' outstretched palm, a hush fell over the gymnasium. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a gradual one, like the volume of the world was being turned down as something completely unexpected unfolded at the center of the dance floor. Parents stopped mid-step, children froze where they stood, and teachers held their breath, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Even the music, still playing through the old school speakers, seemed quieter now, as if it too was watching. Clara stared up at the tall man in the light blue suit, her blue eyes wide and cautious, trying to understand what was happening. She had never seen him before, didn't know his name, and yet something in the way he knelt to her, so formal, so respectful, told her this wasn't a joke. He wasn't here to mock her. He was serious. Everyone else had looked at her with pity, or worse, amusement. He looked at her like she mattered. Alexander slowly rose to his feet, his hand still holding hers gently, as if she were made of glass. He moved with the ease of someone used to commanding rooms far larger than this, yet his body language was humble, patient, soft. Clara, barely up to his waist, looked impossibly small next to him. The contrast between them, the tiny, pale-haired girl in a second-hand dress and the towering, powerful man in designer clothing, was so striking it seemed pulled from a storybook. But there was nothing staged about it. There was only a strange kind of quiet magic, the sort that settles over a room only when something deeply human is taking place. He led her slowly into a gentle waltz, his movements practiced but careful not to overwhelm her. Clara followed hesitantly at first, her feet unsure, her body stiff, but he guided her with a lightness that surprised her. It was not how she imagined adults would move, forceful or controlling, but more like a breeze lifting a paper lantern, always supporting but never dragging. She looked down at her feet, trying to follow, then up at his face. He was smiling, not the tight, fake smiles adults used when they didn't really mean it, but something different. Real. Kind. Warm. Around them, the crowd stood still. No one laughed now. Not a single student jeered. The children who had teased her earlier seemed confused, even embarrassed. A few of them looked at their own parents as if questioning why no one had stepped in earlier. The teachers didn't speak. Even the DJ had stopped making announcements. They all simply watched, spellbound, as the most unexpected pair in the room, an orphan girl and a billionaire CEO, moved in slow circles to the rhythm of a song neither of them had chosen, but both had somehow made their own. Clara began to relax. Her arms, once rigid, softened. Her steps became steadier. And then, without meaning to, she smiled, not because she was told to, not because someone asked her to pretend, but because something inside her truly felt lighter, as if for the first time in a very long time, the heaviness in her chest had lifted. In that moment, she didn't feel like the girl without parents. She didn't feel like the child from the group home who wore hand-me-down shoes and never got picked first for anything. She felt like she belonged. Alexander felt it too. As they danced, his thoughts drifted back to a different time, a different version of himself, a boy not unlike Clara, sitting alone in silence while the world moved on without him. He hadn't remembered that boy in years. But now, as he looked into her eyes, he realized that she reminded him of something he had buried long ago. There was a fragility in her, yes, but also a resilience. The kind of strength that comes not from winning, but from refusing to give up. It stirred something in him that decades of wealth and power had never been able to touch. When the music faded, neither of them moved right away. The song ended, but the spell did not break. The applause began quietly, a single teacher near the edge of the gym clapping softly. Then another. And soon, the room filled with the sound of hands coming together, not in mockery this time, but in awe. The applause grew louder, until even the most skeptical parents and distracted children joined in. Clara looked around, surprised, and then turned back to Alexander. He nodded to her, eyes shining with something unspoken, and bowed slightly. She copied him, giggling shyly. As they left the floor, Clara no longer walked with her eyes on the ground. She stood a little taller, her chin lifted, her heart beating not with fear but with something closer to joy. Alexander placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as he guided her back toward the chairs, but before they reached them, he paused and knelt beside her again. He asked her name. When she told him, he repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. He didn't ask about her parents, or the orphanage, or why she had been dancing alone. He didn't need to. He already understood more than words could say. For the rest of the evening, Clara sat beside him while he talked with the teachers and took photos with other students, but every now and then, he glanced down at her and asked if she was okay. Each time, she nodded. And each time, he smiled again. No one could have predicted that a dance floor would be the place where a forgotten child and a guarded man would find each other. No one knew that, in that simple moment of human connection, something had shifted, something bigger than the school gym, bigger than the headlines that would follow. That night, nothing had been planned. Nothing had been expected. But something had begun that would change both of their lives forever. 2 days after the school dance, the orphanage where Clara lived received an unexpected visitor. It was a bright Wednesday morning, one of those rare days when the air felt fresh and hopeful despite the chipped paint on the window frames and the creaky stairs that echoed with every footstep. The staff were in the middle of the usual routines, sorting laundry, mediating toy disputes, preparing breakfast, when the doorbell rang. Miss Ellen, the senior caretaker and Clara's unofficial protector, opened the door to find a tall man standing in a crisp, light blue suit. He looked out of place, too polished for the dull gray walls behind her, but there was something in his eyes that stopped her from sending him away. He introduced himself simply, Alexander Reeves. She blinked. The name rang a bell. She'd seen it in news articles, on television interviews, maybe even on the side of a building once. But she didn't say anything, only nodded and let him in. She watched his gaze travel slowly around the room, the faded posters, the old wooden chairs, the bulletin board with children's drawings thumbtacked in messy rows. He wasn't frowning, though. In fact, she thought she saw a quiet kind of sadness in his expression, the kind that only someone who recognized loneliness could understand. "I'd like to speak with you about a girl named Clara Anderson," he said, his voice calm but weighted. "I met her at the school dance." Miss Ellen led him into her small office, cluttered with paperwork and mugs of tea gone cold. She motioned for him to sit and pulled out Clara's file, her movements practiced but slow. She was used to donors, curious volunteers, and people making promises they rarely kept. Something about him was different. He wasn't speaking like a man offering charity. He sounded more like someone asking for permission to care. She told him Clara's story, not the version she shared with other potential adopters, the softened, rehearsed version, but the real one. Clara had been found in the back seat of her parents' car after the accident. She had survived by some miracle, while both her mother and father had died on impact. No other relatives had come forward. No close friends. Nothing. She had spent nearly 2 years in the system. Too young to fully understand what she had lost, but old enough to feel it every day. She didn't cause trouble, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry in public. But every so often, when the other children were asleep, Miss Ellen had found her sitting at the window, clutching a worn letter in her lap, staring out as if waiting for someone who would never come. Alexander listened in silence. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask for details she wasn't ready to give. But as Miss Ellen spoke, she noticed something change in his posture. He sat straighter. His hands clasped tightly. His eyes, so guarded at first, shone with something dangerously close to emotion. When she finished, there was a pause between them, heavy and real. "Has anyone ever tried to adopt her?" he asked. Miss Ellen nodded slowly. "Some families came to visit. A few stayed long enough to meet her. But she's quiet. Doesn't make a strong first impression. They always chose someone else." He didn't respond right away. Then he looked at her and said, with startling certainty, "I'd like to start the process of taking her into my care." Miss Ellen blinked. "You mean foster care?" "I mean guardianship," he replied. "And then, if things go well, adoption." She studied him carefully. "Do you have experience with children?" "No," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to feel invisible. I know what it's like to wait for someone who never comes." Miss Ellen believed him. They brought Clara into the office that afternoon. She was holding a stuffed rabbit with one button eye and wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big. When she saw Alexander, her eyes widened in recognition, but she didn't run to him. She just stood in the doorway, uncertain, watching. He knelt again, just like he had that night at the dance. "Hi, Clara," he said softly. "I was wondering if you'd like to visit my home sometime. Just for a little while. We could have dinner. Maybe read a story." She looked up at Miss Ellen, who nodded gently. Then she looked back at him. "Do you have books?" she asked. "I have shelves of them," he replied. "Do you have cocoa? I can learn to make it." She considered this, then nodded. "Okay." It was not a fairy tale moment. No one burst into tears. There was no sweeping music. Just a quiet agreement between a lonely man and a lonely girl that maybe, for a little while, they could try not to be lonely together. Over the next few weeks, Clara began visiting Alexander's apartment after school. At first, only for a few hours, under Miss Ellen's supervision. Then for full evenings. Then weekends. She was cautious, but curious. He was patient, if a bit awkward. He cleared space in his kitchen for her cereal. He bought a small bed for the guest room. He let her pick out new pajamas at the store, even when she chose the glittery ones he didn't understand. He started coming home early from work. He turned off his phone during dinner. He didn't tell anyone at the office why. One night, she asked if he could read to her before bed. He picked a book at random, sat on the edge of her new bed, and read. His voice was rough at first, and used to the rhythm of children's stories, but by the third page, she was curled against his side, eyes half closed. When the story ended, she didn't move. Just whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Alex." He didn't know what to say. So he just said, "You're welcome, Clara." Then he turned off the light and sat in the hallway for a long time, listening to her breathing, wondering when the last time was that someone had stayed near her as she fell asleep. He realized he didn't want to go back to the way things were. Not for himself. And definitely not for her. Alexander Reeves had always believed his home was perfect. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by professionals. The walls were covered in subtle, expensive tones of gray and ivory. The floors were polished oak, the shelves filled with hardcovers no one had ever opened, and the kitchen gleamed like a showroom, all chrome and marble, spotless and unused. His penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side was perched high above the city, with glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of Manhattan that most people would only see on postcards. But despite the wealth, the beauty, and the endless space, there was no warmth in it. His home had been designed to impress, not to comfort. It was a place meant for meetings, brief visits, solitude. It echoed when he walked through it alone. The first time Clara stepped into his apartment, she didn't say anything for several minutes. She stood near the entrance, gripping her worn stuffed rabbit, her eyes scanning the pristine surfaces and tall ceilings like she had just entered a museum. He watched her quietly, unsure of what she was thinking. He had never brought a child here. Never brought anyone here for anything more personal than a catered dinner or a corporate photo shoot. He realized suddenly how empty the space felt through her eyes. Not just physically, but emotionally. When she finally spoke, she asked, "Where are the toys?" Alexander blinked. "I don't have any." "Not even one?" she asked, sounding more puzzled than disappointed. He shook his head. "But we can get some. Whatever you like." That night, for the first time since moving in, he opened the guest room door and let someone stay there. It had always been called the guest room, but it had never had a guest. He'd ordered the bed, the dresser, the nightstand all at once, months ago, without thinking anyone would use them. Now he brought in new sheets, blue ones with stars on them, and let Clara choose where she wanted the stuffed animals to sit. She picked a corner and asked if she could tape a drawing to the wall. He said yes without hesitation. The next morning, she drew a sun with a smiley face and a house with 2 windows and a crooked door. He didn't tell her that the house in her drawing looked more like a home than the one they were standing in. As days passed, the apartment began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. A tiny pair of shoes sat by the front door. There were cereal boxes in the pantry he never would have bought on his own. There were books in the living room with brightly colored covers and dog-eared pages. The fridge, once a sterile display of bottled water and untouched takeout containers, now held juice boxes and half-eaten apples. He learned how to make hot cocoa, not the kind from a machine, but from scratch, with milk warmed on the stove and marshmallows added by Clara's tiny hand. His assistant was confused when he canceled his early morning meetings. His housekeeper was astonished to find him cooking breakfast. The stock market still moved without him, the company still ran, but he, Alexander Reeves, was now spending his evenings figuring out the difference between bedtime stories and chapter books. Clara didn't adjust quickly, not completely. She was still quiet at times, especially at dinner. She didn't laugh easily. She didn't ask for hugs or talk about her feelings. But she started asking questions. She wanted to know what all the buttons on the remote control did. She asked him why he didn't have a cat. She wondered if skyscrapers could tip over in strong wind. And slowly, she started sharing things too. She told him about her favorite color, blue, like the sky, not like her dress. She said she liked the sound the elevator made when it reached their floor. She admitted she sometimes dreamed her parents were still alive, but in the dream, they couldn't see her. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he just sat with her in silence, and she didn't seem to mind. One evening, when the sky outside was turning orange with sunset, Clara asked if she could listen to music. He hesitated. He had music, of course, but nothing a child would recognize. Still, he asked her what kind she liked. She shrugged and said, something with dancing. So he searched for children's songs online, found one that sounded cheerful, and let it play through the sound system. She started to sway in the middle of the living room, slowly at first, then spinning, her arms outstretched like they had been at the school dance. She didn't say it, but he knew she was remembering that night. Without thinking, he stood and joined her. His movements were stiff, out of rhythm, but she grinned. "You're doing it wrong," she said. "I know," he replied. "But I'm trying." "That's okay," she said. "You're still dancing." From that day forward, she called him Mr. Alex, even when they were alone. He didn't correct her. He found he liked the way it sounded, soft and familiar, but with a hint of formality that made it feel respectful. He liked the way she asked questions about things no one else thought about. He liked the way she would peek into his office just to say goodnight, even when she didn't need anything. He liked the sound of small footsteps on marble, the trail of blankets left behind on the couch, the quiet singing she did when she thought no one could hear her. He started keeping his phone in a drawer after 6 o'clock. He stopped checking his email during meals. And when Clara fell asleep, sometimes after 3 stories instead of 1, he would sit outside her door for a few minutes, just listening. Not because he needed to, but because, for the first time in a long time, he felt responsible for something fragile and real. He had always believed his home was perfect. But now he was starting to understand that perfection didn't come from silence or symmetry. It came from spilled juice, crumpled drawings, and unexpected laughter. It came from late-night questions and early morning waffles. It came from sharing space with someone who didn't care how expensive the rug was, only whether they were allowed to dance on it. It came from her. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Clara came into Alexander's office with the letter in her hand. She stood in the doorway silently at first, dressed in her favorite soft blue pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep. The storm outside tapped against the tall windows like restless fingers, and the city beyond was blurred by fog and water streaks. Alexander was sitting at his desk, reading reports he didn't care about, half listening to the Weather Channel murmuring in the background. When he noticed her presence, he immediately turned down the volume and gave her his full attention. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked across the wide room and placed the envelope on the edge of his desk. It was old and creased, the paper yellowed at the corners. Her fingers hesitated as she pulled her hand away from it. "This is from my mom and dad," she said softly. "Miss Ellen read it once, but I didn't understand all the words. Can you read it to me? The real way." Alexander picked up the envelope carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. There was a name on the front in faded ink, Clara Anderson. No stamp. No address. Just her name. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if it had been written in a hurry or with trembling hands. He glanced at Clara, who had climbed into the chair opposite him and tucked her knees up to her chest. Her eyes were wide, not afraid, but waiting, ready for something she didn't fully understand but somehow needed to hear. He opened the envelope slowly and unfolded the letter. It was written in 2 parts, one section in a woman's voice, the other in a man's. The words were filled with love, regret, and an aching hope. They had written it together, clearly knowing that they might not survive what was coming. Clara's mother had written about her daughter's smile, how she danced in the kitchen, how she loved pancakes with too much syrup. Her father had written about a friend, someone from their past who might still be out there, someone they had helped once long ago. Alexander's breath caught when he read the name. If anyone finds this, the letter read, and Clara has no one left, please try to find our old friend, Alexander Reeves. We met him on a back road years ago. He was lost, freezing, scared. We gave him food, a ride, kindness. He was just a teenager then, but there was something in his eyes that said he would become someone strong. If he's alive, if he remembers us, maybe he can help her when we no longer can. He stared at the page in stunned silence. For a moment, he thought his vision had blurred, but it wasn't the rain, it was something inside him, something raw and buried that had come surging back. He looked up at Clara, who was watching him with quiet intensity, her chin resting on her knees. I think this is about me, he said, barely recognizing his own voice. Clara blinked. You knew my mom and dad. I think I did. A long time ago. I didn't know their names, but it has to be them. And then the memory hit him like lightning cracking through the fog. He was 17, lost on a road somewhere in upstate New York, his car dead after a foolish decision to drive through the night without checking the gas gauge. It was winter, bitter and sharp, and he had been walking in the dark, shivering, too proud to call for help, too afraid to admit he'd messed up. A car had pulled over. A man and woman had gotten out, bundled in coats, and offered him a ride without hesitation. They didn't ask questions. They gave him hot tea from a thermos, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and drove him 2 hours out of their way just to make sure he got home safely. They had told him their names, but he hadn't remembered them. He'd thanked them, promised to repay them someday. But life had swept him away, college, business, ambition, and he'd never seen them again. Until now. He looked at Clara and something inside him shifted, something irreversible. He had been called here, not by chance, not by coincidence, but by a debt he hadn't even known was waiting to be repaid. You saved me before you were even born, he whispered. She tilted her head. What do you mean? Your parents helped me when I was lost. They took care of me when no one else would. I think, they wanted me to do the same for you. She sat very still, taking in his words. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his on the desk. Is that why you danced with me? She asked. I didn't know it then, he said. But maybe something deep inside me did. The storm outside thundered, but inside, there was a strange and powerful stillness. The letter lay between them like a thread connecting past and present, grief and healing, loss and purpose. From that moment on, Alexander no longer thought of Clara as a temporary part of his life. She wasn't a guest or a project or even a responsibility. She was a promise he hadn't known he'd made, a chapter of his own story he hadn't expected to continue. The weight of the letter stayed with him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gift. A second chance. A reason to believe that sometimes, even in the darkest corners of the world, love finds a way to echo back. That night, after she had gone to bed and the apartment was quiet again, Alexander sat alone with the letter in his lap. He read it 3 more times, memorizing every line, every word, every plea. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and put it in the drawer beside his bed, not because he was hiding it, but because it belonged close. It was no longer a message from the past. It was the beginning of everything that was yet to come. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early spring. The sky over Manhattan was pale and heavy with clouds, as though it hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to cry or simply hang silent over the city. Inside the courthouse, fluorescent lights flickered and chairs creaked under the weight of anxious bodies. The family court waiting room was a blend of paper coffee cups, rustling folders, tired social workers, and the hum of muted conversations. Alexander sat stiffly in a dark gray suit that he had chosen not for power but for simplicity. Across from him, Clara swung her legs gently back and forth under her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her little face unusually serious. It had been 4 months since she moved in. 4 months of bedtime stories, spilled milk, morning routines, giggles from the hallway, unexpected questions, and silent moments that spoke louder than words ever could. But none of that guaranteed what they were hoping for today. The guardianship was temporary, approved without resistance thanks to Alexander's wealth, his spotless record, and Clara's quiet cooperation. But adoption was something else entirely. That required evaluation, scrutiny, justification. And not everyone thought a billionaire CEO with no prior experience in parenting should be given full custody of a fragile little girl who had already lost everything once before. Alexander had gone through every required procedure, attended the parenting classes, endured home inspections, interviews, psychological evaluations. He'd sat across from caseworkers who looked at him with polite skepticism, as if trying to locate the human behind the headlines. He answered every question truthfully, even the uncomfortable ones. Yes, he had been emotionally distant in past relationships. No, he had never envisioned himself as a father. Yes, his work had always come first, until now. No, he didn't believe this was charity or impulse. Yes, he understood the responsibility. And yes, he was ready to give up whatever was necessary to make Clara feel safe and loved for the rest of her life. But still, the doubt lingered in the system like a stain that refused to be washed out. The law was built to protect children, and it had to question everyone, even those with the best intentions. The opposing attorney, representing the city, had reviewed Clara's file with cold precision and noted the gaps: no formal family history on Alexander's side, no prior experience with trauma-informed care, a lifestyle so removed from typical parenthood it bordered on surreal. In her arguments, she painted a picture of a man disconnected from reality, driven by guilt or sentiment, perhaps even ego, trying to fix something in himself through the adoption of a child who needed stability, not symbolism. Alexander remained calm through it all, but beneath his calm, there was a storm. It wasn't the fear of losing a court case, it was the fear of losing her. He had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, walked away from boardroom wars without a scratch, but none of that had ever made his hands shake the way they did when Clara reached for him in her sleep or when she left her drawings on his desk with the words, "For Mr. Alex," scribbled in wobbly letters. When they were finally called into the courtroom, Clara reached up and took his hand. Her grip was small but firm, and he held it like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The judge was an older man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through performance. He listened patiently as both sides made their case. The city's representative presented data, rules, psychological reports, and a cautious but firm recommendation that the guardianship remain temporary until further observation. Alexander's lawyer, respectful but passionate, countered with records of care, school reports, character references, and the story of how Clara had transformed under his roof. There was no drama in the room, no shouting or objections, just the low, steady pulse of a decision being weighed. At one point, the judge looked directly at Clara. "Miss Anderson," he said gently, "would you like to say something?" Alexander froze, turning slowly toward her. They hadn't planned for this. She wasn't coached. But Clara, without hesitation, stood up from her chair and stepped forward. Her dress, a soft shade of lavender, swayed around her knees. She didn't look scared. Just very, very certain. "He doesn't know how to braid hair," she began, which caused a quiet chuckle in the courtroom. "But he makes my pancakes smile with syrup. He burns toast sometimes, but he always tries again. He reads books even when he's tired. He sits outside my room when I have nightmares, and he never tells me I'm being silly." She looked at the judge, her voice clear. "He doesn't yell. He doesn't forget. He asks if I'm okay, even when I say yes and I'm not really. He danced with me when no one else would. He came back for me." Then she looked back at Alexander. "He's not just my friend. He's my home." There was silence after that, deep, full silence. Even the opposing counsel lowered her eyes. The judge sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I believe that says more than anything in these folders," he said. "Adoption is approved." Alexander didn't cry. He couldn't. Not in front of everyone. But when Clara returned to her seat and crawled into his lap without asking, resting her head against his chest, he placed one arm around her shoulders and the other across her back, holding her so tightly that it became impossible to tell who was comforting whom. For the first time since that school gymnasium, he felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing all his life: peace. Outside, the clouds had started to part. The sun peeked through, timid but determined, casting light across the courthouse steps as they exited together, no longer a man and a child, but a father and a daughter, bound not by blood but by choice, by courage, and by the miracle of being found. 2 years had passed since that quiet courtroom morning when Clara was officially adopted. Life didn't change all at once after the judge's ruling, it evolved slowly, like petals opening to light, but it changed completely. The apartment that once echoed with silence had become a home in every sense of the word. Its walls were no longer blank but decorated with Clara's drawings, framed photos from weekend trips, and the kind of joyful clutter that naturally follows a child's footsteps. There were muddy sneakers by the door, forgotten toys under the couch, and the faint scent of vanilla in the air from the cookies they always seemed to be baking. Alexander no longer lived for efficiency. He lived for mornings that began with sleepy giggles and evenings that ended with whispered stories under warm blankets. Clara had blossomed into someone brighter, louder, and more secure. She still carried quietness with her, but it was no longer the silence of sorrow, it had become the thoughtful hush of someone who listened deeply and loved carefully. She danced more now, not only in her room or in the living room, but on stage. Her school had placed her in the front row of the spring performance, something unthinkable just 2 years prior when she could barely make eye contact during practice. And when she moved to music, people watched, not with laughter or pity, but with admiration. Alexander had changed too, though he didn't notice it at first. He laughed more freely, asked more questions, gave longer hugs. He found himself caring about small things: a scrape on Clara's knee, the loss of her favorite pencil, the fear of thunderstorms. He had once been a man who looked at the world as a series of problems to be solved, obstacles to be managed. But Clara had taught him that not everything needed solving, some things just needed presence. Love, he learned, didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was quiet hands brushing hair from a forehead, a steady voice at bedtime, or simply showing up when it mattered most. The story of their bond, unexpected and beautiful, did not stay hidden. A journalist who had attended the adoption hearing wrote a piece about it, a small article at first, something for a local parenting blog. But it was shared, then shared again, and soon national outlets picked up the story. They called it, "The Dance That Changed Two Lives," and it spread like fire. Not because Alexander was wealthy or because Clara was orphaned, but because people were starving for something real. Something kind. Something that defied the cynicism of the world and reminded people what connection could do. Letters began arriving at their door. Hundreds. Then thousands. Some from children in foster care who said they no longer felt invisible. Some from single parents who found courage in Clara's voice at the hearing. Some from businessmen who admitted that they, too, had forgotten what mattered most. Alexander read every single one. Clara helped. She kept the ones that made her smile in a shoebox under her bed. They were invited to speak at charity events, and though Alexander initially hesitated, Clara was the one who convinced him. "Maybe someone else is waiting for their dance," she said. And so they spoke, not about wealth or tragedy, but about what happens when people refuse to turn away. Together they launched a foundation called the Dance of Hope. Its mission was simple but powerful: to support older children in foster care who were often overlooked for adoption, to fund after-school art and dance programs, and to remind people that small acts of love can leave lifelong echoes. On the anniversary of the school dance, the one that started it all, the school invited them back. It was a new generation of students now, but the gym looked exactly the same. Clara, now 8 and confident, wore a dress of pale blue satin, custom-made by a local designer who had read their story. Her hair was still pulled into a bun, but this time there were tiny rhinestones in it, glittering like stars. She stood in front of the room, microphone in hand, looking smaller than the crowd but more composed than anyone in it. "I danced alone once," she began, her voice steady and soft, "because I didn't have anyone. And people laughed. But someone saw me. He didn't laugh. He stood up. And he danced with me." She paused and looked toward Alexander, who stood quietly at the edge of the gym. His eyes glistened. "I know now that there are a lot of kids who feel alone. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you think no one sees you. But I promise, sometimes the person who's meant to see you is just waiting for the right moment to find you. So don't stop dancing." And then, as the lights dimmed and the music began, Clara stepped forward. A new melody filled the room, not the same one as before, but something hopeful and soaring. She began to dance, not alone this time, but with grace and confidence. And just as she twirled into the center of the floor, Alexander walked toward her and offered his hand. He no longer hesitated. No longer wondered what people might think. He simply took her hand and danced. The applause that followed wasn't loud at first. It was gentle, respectful, as if the crowd didn't want to interrupt something sacred. But it grew, because people could feel what was happening. They could feel the truth of it. Not a performance, not a spectacle, but a moment of deep, shared humanity. By the time they finished, everyone was on their feet. Later that night, back at home, Clara curled up beside Alexander on the couch, holding a cup of cocoa, her cheeks still glowing from the spotlight. She leaned her head on his arm and said, "That was my favorite dance." He kissed the top of her head and replied, "Mine too." And somewhere deep inside both of them, a quiet voice whispered that they were no longer broken pieces of separate stories, but part of the same one. Not a perfect story. Not one without sorrow. But a story full of light, stitched together by moments of bravery, kindness, and a single choice to say yes when it would have been easier to walk away. This story is more than just a touching tale about an orphan girl and a wealthy man with a guarded heart, it's a quiet revolution against indifference. It reminds us that the most life-changing moments often begin not with grand plans, but with simple, human choices, standing up, reaching out, staying present. What makes this ending powerful isn't a fairy tale adoption or the media attention, it's the fact that two people, both carrying invisible wounds, chose to heal not by retreating inward, but by stepping toward each other. Clara's final dance isn't just symbolic of hope, it's proof that love, when it's real, doesn't care about status, bloodlines, or perfect timing. It finds you in the silence, in the awkward attempts, in the second chances. And Alexander's transformation is a reminder that redemption doesn't always come from sacrifice or success, but from showing up when it matters most. The story closes like a soft exhale, leaving behind not drama, but warmth, and a quiet challenge to all of us, to notice who's dancing alone, and to be brave enough to step forward.